The dining room of Marcus's new suburban mansion smelled of melted butter, sea salt, and the sharp metallic tang of ungratefulness. It was a Saturday evening, the kind of weekend dinner I used to live for, the kind of tradition I thought would be the soft landing for my final years. Instead, I sat at the edge of the heavy mahogany table, a table I had paid for as a housewarming gift, feeling the choking sorrow rise in my throat like cold ash. Marcus didn't look at me. He was too busy dipping a succulent steaming claw into a ramekin of drawn butter. The light from the Swarovski chandelier, another gift from my hard-earned savings, danced off the oily sheen on his chin. Across from him, his wife Chloe sat with her spine rigid, her fingers adorned with diamonds that caught the light with every practiced movement of her silver fork. In front of them sat platters of roasted asparagus, garlic-infused fingerling potatoes, and two massive lobsters, their shells a vibrant, mocking red. In front of me sat a cracked ceramic bowl. Inside was a clump of white rice, hardened by the refrigerator's chill into a singular, unappealing mass. It was topped with a lonely, withered spoonful of yesterday's beef stir-fry, the meat gray and rubbery, the vegetables translucent and limp. There was no steam rising from my bowl, only the faint, sour scent of something that had already surrendered its life to a Tupperware container. "Mom, don't look at us like that," Chloe said, her voice a sharp, materialistic trill that sliced through the quiet hum of the air conditioning. She didn't even pause between bites of her lobster tail. "You know your digestive system isn't what it used to be. At 68, your body just can't process these heavy, rich proteins. We're doing this for your health, really. We consulted a blog about senior vitality, and it said light grains are best." She took a slow sip of a Chardonnay that I knew cost $200 a bottle. "Besides," she added, her eyes flicking to my bowl with a look of practiced charity, "it's such a waste to throw away perfectly good leftovers. You've always taught us to be frugal, haven't you? Think of it as being environmentally conscious." Marcus nodded, his mouth full of expensive meat. "She's right, Mom. It's efficient. You always liked things efficient. So this is how they repay me?" The thought felt like a physical weight pressing against my lungs. I felt a low, slow thrum of pain in my chest, an ache that started in my calloused palms, hands that had spent 40 years building a food supply empire from a single rusted delivery truck, and traveled up to my heart. I looked down at the cold rice. Each grain looked like a tiny frozen tear. I tried to speak, but my voice was fragmented, a ghost of the authority I once held. "Marcus, the rice is cold. I haven't had a warm meal since yesterday morning. Surely there's enough, just a small piece of the claw?" Chloe let out a theatrical sigh, dropping her silver fork with a loud, purposeful clink against the fine bone china. "Mom, please, let's not make a scene. This is exactly why Marcus said you're getting difficult. You're being so emotional about food. It's just fuel. At your age, you should be focused on clarity and longevity, not indulgence. Honestly, you're lucky we even invite you over on weekends, given how confused you've been lately about the company's internal logistics." Marcus didn't defend me. He didn't even look up. He just reached for another lemon wedge. I felt the hurt and exhaustion wash over me in waves. I could hear the sound of my own shallow breathing in the pauses between their chewing. My son, the boy I had worked 20-hour shifts for, The boy whose education I had secured by skipping meals for a decade was now watching me starve in the midst of plenty. He saw a relic with a weak stomach. He saw a faded memory that was becoming an inconvenience. Did they really think I had become that senile? I reached for my water glass, my movements slow and shaky, playing the part they had written for me. I was the self-sacrificing mother, and the woman who had faded into the background, so Marcus could have the delusions of power he currently wore like a tailored suit. I looked at the lobster, then back at my gray, refrigerated rice. The spatial contrast was almost poetic. The vibrant red of their greed against the dull gray of my supposed obsolescence. They believed they were the masters of the house, the ones who decided who feasted and who survived on scraps. They had forgotten that the very lobster on their plates had traveled through a supply chain that bore my name. They had forgotten that I wasn't just a guest at their table. I was the one who owned the table. I took a bite of the cold rice. It felt like gravel in my mouth. I chewed slowly, my mind shifting from the choking sorrow of a mother to the strategic intelligence of a CEO. The voice in my head, once low and wounded, began to sharpen into something lethal. The weekend dinner wasn't over. It was just the first course of a very long lesson. We often think that by giving our children everything, we are building them a fortress. But sometimes all we are doing is building a pedestal for their arrogance. I realized that night that silence isn't always a sign of weakness. Sometimes it's just the quiet before the storm hits the coast. When the person you love most offers you a bowl of cold rice while they feast on the fruits of your labor, they aren't just feeding you leftovers. They are telling you exactly what they think your soul is worth. And I decided right then that my price was about to go up. The steam from their lobster tails drifted across the table, a buttery, salt-slicked ghost that seemed to mock the dry, refrigerated scent of my own special meal. I stared into the cracked ceramic bowl. The gray grains of rice clumped together like miniature frozen tombstones. My throat felt tight, that familiar choking sorrow that comes not from a lack of food, but from a total starvation of respect. My mind, weary and fragmented by the weight of 70 years, began to drift back. It escaped this cold marble mausoleum of a dining room and retreated to the winter of 1988. I remembered the smell of diesel and the way the wind in Pennsylvania didn't just blow. It bit through your skin until your bones felt like glass. When Marcus's father passed, he didn't leave me a life insurance policy or a retirement fund, and he left me a rusted-out delivery truck with a temperamental starter and a mortgage that was screaming for blood. I was a young mother with a 5-year-old boy who had outgrown his boots in the middle of a blizzard. I looked at Marcus now, his fingers soft, manicured, and gleaming with lobster grease. And then I looked at my own hands. My knuckles are swollen now, mapped with the faint white scars of decades spent hauling crates in the pre-dawn dark. Those hands had gripped that steering wheel until they froze in place. I had been hard-working to the point of erasure. I had been self-sacrificing until there was nothing left of Elena Vance but the engine that kept Marcus running. I remembered the Tuesdays of those early years. I would pull the truck over near a clinic in a part of town where the streetlights were always broken. I would sit in a plastic chair for 2 hours watching my own life force swirl through a tube into a plastic bag. I sold my blood plasma twice a week just to keep the heaters on in our cramped apartment and to ensure Marcus had fresh milk. I would walk out into the cold, light-headed and shivering, clutching $30 like it was a gold bar, all so he could have the life I never did. So this is how they repay me? The question echoed in the hollow chambers of my heart. I had built Vance Global Logistics from that one rusted truck. I had spent 40 years negotiating with union bosses, outmaneuvering corporate raiders, and sleeping in rest stops so I could save every penny for Marcus's Ivy League tuition. I was the architect of the very abundance they were currently using to exclude me. "Mom, you're staring again," Chloe said, her voice a sharp, materialistic snap that brought me back to the present. She delicately patted her lips with a linen napkin that probably cost more than my first week's groceries in 1988. "See? This is what I mean, Marcus. She's drifting. It's the lack of proper nutrition. All that heavy food you used to eat back in the day. It's caught up to her. This rice is much better for your cognitive maintenance. Isn't it, Mom?" Marcus didn't even look up from his plate. He was expertly extracting a piece of meat from a claw, his movements practiced and entitled. "Yeah, Mom. Focus on the rice. We need you sharp. Chloe thinks you've been hesitant lately. Maybe it's the early stages of decline." Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they think the woman who outran debt collectors, survived 3 recessions, and then built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire from a box of plasma center bandages couldn't see exactly what they were doing? They weren't worried about my cognitive maintenance. They were preparing the soil for my burial. They wanted the final voting shares of the supply chain. They wanted the keys to the vault, and they wanted me to hand them over while thanking them for the cold rice. I felt a low, slow thrum of heat in my chest. It wasn't the stir-fry, it was the old engine of Elena Vance, sparking to life after a long, cold winter of silence. I looked at the Swarovski chandelier, the marble floors, the designer clothes, all of it bought with the blood I had sold and the sweat I had poured. I had been too self-sacrificing. I had allowed my quiet wisdom to be mistaken for a fading mind. I had let them believe that because I had stepped back to let my son lead, I had forgotten how to drive. I took a bite of the cold rice. It was hard and tasteless, a perfect metaphor for the love Marcus was currently offering me. I chewed it slowly, letting the hurt and exhaustion settle into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. They saw a relic to be managed. They saw an old woman who was lucky to be invited to the table. They had forgotten who owned the table. They had forgotten that every lobster, every grain of rice, and every drop of wine in this house moved through a network that only existed because I permitted it. The empathy phase was over. I had felt enough for them. Now it was time to feel something for the woman who had sold her blood to build a world that now tried to starve her. We often tell ourselves that sacrifice is its own reward, that seeing our children succeed is the ultimate payment for our pain. But there is a point where sacrifice becomes a permission slip for their cruelty. When you give someone everything, they eventually start to believe you never had anything of value to begin with. I sat at that table and realized that I hadn't just raised a son. I had raised a consumer of my own soul. And consumers are very easy to cut off when the supply runs dry. The sound of a lobster shell cracking sounds a lot like a heartbreaking, if you listen closely enough. It's a sharp, brittle snap, the sound of something protective being forced open to reveal the soft vulnerability inside. As I sat there, the light from the Swarovski chandelier glinted off Marcus's buttery fingers, and I realized that the veil of filial concern they had draped over this dinner was becoming dangerously thin. It was no longer a shroud. It was a ghost, and the skeleton beneath it was nothing but pure, unadulterated greed. "Marcus," I said, my voice fragmented and barely above the hum of the climate-controlled air. I pushed the cracked ceramic bowl of cold rice a few inches away. The gray stir-fry looked like a heap of wet cardboard in the shadows. "The rice is cold. It's actually quite hard to chew. And I haven't had a proper warm meal since yesterday morning. Surely there's enough of that lobster. Just a small piece of the claw for the taste." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the rhythmic clink-clink of Chloe's silver fork. She didn't look up immediately. She took another slow, purposeful sip of the vintage Chardonnay, the wine I had stocked in their cellar, before letting out a theatrical sigh that seemed to drain the remaining oxygen from the room. "Mom, please," she said, dropping the fork with a loud, ringing clack against her fine bone china. "We've been over this. Let's not make a scene. This is exactly why Marcus said you're getting difficult. You're being so emotional about food. It's just fuel, Elena. At 68, your focus should be on mental clarity and longevity, not these primitive indulgences." She leaned forward, her diamonds flashing like warning lights. "Honestly, you're lucky we even invite you over on weekends, given how confused you've been lately. You missed 2 check-in calls with the East Coast logistics manager last week. We're just trying to keep your senior vitality high by keeping your system clean. Rich food leads to a sluggish mind, and Marcus and I have far too much at stake to let the company founder drift into a fog." "So this is how they repay me?" I looked at Marcus. My son. The boy I had protected from every cold wind that blew through our rusted delivery truck. He didn't defend me. He didn't even raise his eyes. He just reached for another lemon wedge, his movements practiced and entitled, born from a lifetime of never having to wonder if there would be enough. "She's right, Mom," Marcus muttered, his voice thick with the delusions of power he had worn since I handed him the regional keys. "About the company. I noticed you still haven't signed over the final Tier 1 voting shares. You're just sitting on them, holding up the New Jersey expansion. Chloe thinks it's because you're starting to forget the strategic goals we set. You're old, Mom. What do you even know about the current digital supply chain? The world is moving faster than your quiet wisdom can keep up with. Did they really think I had become that senile? I felt the hurt and exhaustion wash over me in waves, a leaden weight in my chest. They weren't just feeding me scraps. They were trying to starve me out of my own legacy. They wanted me to believe I was a relic, a fading shadow who should be grateful for a cold bowl of leftovers while they feasted on the empire I had bled for. Chloe's Senior Vitality blog was just a polite way of saying they were waiting for me to wither away so they could stop pretending to love me. I built the very chain that delivered that lobster to your door, Marcus, I whispered, my voice starting to lose its tremor, sharpening into something colder. I knew the digital supply chain when it was still written on carbon copy clipboards in the rain. Marcus let out a short, disrespectful laugh. You built a truck route, Mom. I built a distribution network. There's a difference. Now finish your rice. We're late for the charity gala, and we really don't have time for another one of your memory lane lectures. It's inefficient. I looked at the spatial contrast in that moment, the vibrant, steaming red of their greed against the dull, gray clump of my supposed obsolescence. They saw a woman with a weak digestive system. I saw two people who had forgotten that the hand that builds the empire is the only one that knows where the foundations are buried. I took a slow, methodical bite of the cold rice. It felt like gravel, but I chewed it with a grim, hard-working determination. I may be old, Marcus, I thought, watching him wipe lobster grease from his chin with a silk napkin, but I am not foolish, and you've forgotten who actually owns the mountain you're standing on. The thinning veil had finally torn. The disrespect was no longer a subtext. It was the main course. As they stood up to leave for their gala, leaving me to clean the table like a common servant, I realized that my self-sacrificing nature had reached its expiration date. My kindness was never a doormat, and tonight I was going to stop being the host and start being the auditor. When the people you raise start treating your history like an inconvenience, they aren't just being rude. They are telling you they no longer fear your power. I realized that night that being self-sacrificing for people who don't value the sacrifice is just a slow form of suicide. They wanted efficiency. Fine. I was about to show them exactly how efficient a woman with 40 years of logistics experience can be when she decides to close the most expensive account in her life, her ungrateful children. The silence of a $5 million house doesn't sound like peace. It sounds like the ticking of a debt that is finally, irrevocably coming due. I sat alone in the vast vaulted dining room, the shadows of the Swarovski chandelier stretching across the mahogany table like the fingers of a ghost. Marcus and Chloe had swept out of the room in a cloud of perfume and self-importance, leaving me with the wreckage of their feast and my own bowl of gray refrigerated rice. The house was a masterpiece of cold luxury, but as I sat there, the choking sorrow of the last hour began to crystallize into something much harder, something sharper. I looked at the half-eaten lobster shells on Marcus's plate. They were bright red, a vibrant mockery of the trash he had deemed suitable for the woman who gave him life. I felt the hurt and exhaustion in my bones, a leaden weight that usually made me want to simply disappear into the upholstery. But then I caught my reflection in the polished surface of the table. My eyes weren't confused. They weren't drifting. Beneath the wrinkles, there was a flicker of the woman who had once stared down union bosses on a frozen loading dock in 1992. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that because I had moved slowly, my mind had stopped running at the speed of a global engine? I stood up. My knees popped. A hard-working sound, a reminder of the miles I had walked so they could run. I didn't go to the sink to wash their dishes. Instead, I walked into Marcus's home office, the architecture of the empire. The office was a shrine to his delusions of power, chrome, glass, and leather. He had a portrait of himself on the wall, looking visionary. I sat in his ergonomic chair and pulled my smartphone from my silk blazer. I didn't need his password. I didn't need to hack a vault. My hidden weapon was the very air his company breathed. Marcus ran Vance distribution east. He saw the trucks. He saw the local warehouses. He saw the invoices he sent to grocery chains. But in his arrogance, he had stopped looking at the Vance Global Logistics and Supply Parent Company, the entity that owned the trademark, the patents, and the very land his warehouses sat on. Most importantly, he had forgotten that I personally held the master supply chain agreement. I logged into the private corporate portal, my fingers moving with a clear-headed and sharp precision. I pulled up the preferential subsidiary terms for the East Coast branch. Because he was my son, I had allowed Marcus a 90-day rolling grace period on all supply costs for the last 3 years. I had personally signed off on a maternal discount of 40% on every crate of organic poultry, grain, and high-end seafood his company moved. That lobster he had just devoured, he had bought it from my supply line at nearly half the market price. I opened the calculator app. I began to run the numbers for the upcoming quarter. The mathematics of disrespect. If I revoked the preferential discount, Marcus's operating costs would spike instantly. Without that 40% cushion, his company wasn't expanding. It was a sinking ship. He was currently carrying $12 million in short-term debt, predicated on the efficiency of his low costs. If I collected the backdated credits I was owed, he wouldn't just be in trouble. He would be bankrupt by Monday morning. The strategic intelligence. I felt a surge of strategic intelligence flood my system, a warmth more satisfying than any meal. I wasn't the Raylet Chloe mocked in her senior vitality blogs. I was the auditor. I looked at the clock. 9:15 p.m. They were at the gala, sipping champagne, and telling their friends how they managed their aging mother. They thought they were the kings of the mountain, but they had forgotten who had built the mountain out of blood, sweat, and plasma center bandages. I placed a single call to Sarah, my head of legal, and a woman who had been by my side since we were both hauling crates in the rain. "Sarah, it's Elena," I said. My voice was no longer fragmented. It was the voice that had built a multi-million-dollar empire. "I need you to trigger the ethics and integrity clause in the Vance East subsidiary contract, effective at midnight tomorrow. I want the preferential credit lines closed, every single one." "Elena?" Sarah's voice crackled with surprise. "That's a nuclear option. Marcus will lose everything. Are you sure?" I looked at the cold bowl of rice sitting on the distant dining table. I thought about the smell of the lobster and the sound of my son laughing while his mother stared at scraps. "I am quite sure, Sarah," I replied. "It seems my digestive system has finally decided it can no longer stomach the taste of betrayal. I'm reclaiming the empire if he wants to be a businessman. Let's see how he handles a real market price." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark office for a moment. And the world often mistakes quiet wisdom for silence and self-sacrifice for weakness. They see the gray hair and assume the fire has gone out. But a master of her craft doesn't need to shout to be heard. She only needs to know which lever to pull. We spend our lives building empires for our children, hoping they will be the guardians of our legacy. But if they become the scavengers of your soul instead of the protectors of your pride, you must remember that you are the one who wrote the map. The turning point had passed. I wasn't a victim of their cruelty anymore. I was the architect of their consequence. I stood up, smoothed my suit, and walked out of the office. I didn't feel tired. I felt firm and decisive. I took a final look at the cold rice. I didn't eat it. I walked to the kitchen. I took the remaining lobster from the fridge, the heavy protein Chloe said I couldn't handle, and sat down to a very late, very warm, and very expensive snack. "So this is how I repay you," I whispered to the empty room, "with the truth." The clash was coming, and for the first time in years, I was the one holding the bill. The morning light didn't just enter my bedroom. It performed an audit, illuminating the dust motes and the deep permanent grooves in my palms, scars earned from 4 decades of holding up a world that Marcus now thought he owned. I woke up in my own apartment, a space Marcus often referred to as shabby or sentimental, but which I knew was merely warm. The spatial contrast was a physical relief. Here there were no vaulted ceilings to echo my loneliness, no Swarovski crystals to mock my history. There was only the scent of fresh coffee, the ticking of a wooden clock, and the framed photograph of my late husband, David, sitting on the mantel. In the photo, we were standing in front of our first truck, a rusted, temperamental beast that we had affectionately named the Iron Mule. We weren't wearing designer suits. We were wearing grease-stained jumpsuits and the widest, most hard-working smiles you've ever seen. I sat at my small oak table, the wood worn smooth by years of my hands resting upon it, and I felt the quiet wisdom of 40 years in the industry settling into my bones. The choking sorrow of the previous night's cold rice dinner had crystallized into something much harder, something sharper. So this is how they repay me, I thought, sipping my coffee. Did they really think I had become that senile? Marcus looked at his distribution east firm and saw a throne. He suffered from the most dangerous of delusions of power. He thought the crown made the king, rather than the labor. He had forgotten that I wasn't just his mother. I was the supply chain queen, the hidden asset, the master agreement. I pulled a leather-bound folder from my desk. Inside was the master supply chain and logistics agreement for Vance Global. Marcus had signed the subsidiary contract 3 years ago without reading the fine print, an oversight born of his own materialistic arrogance. He had been so eager to see his name on the glass doors that he never questioned why his operating costs were so miraculously low. For 3 years, I had been his silent benefactor. I had applied a maternal discount, a 40% reduction in procurement costs for every ounce of seafood, every grain of wheat, and every crate of poultry his warehouses moved. I had been self-sacrificing to the point of invisibility, allowing my own parent company to absorb his losses, just so he could feel like a visionary entrepreneur. But there was a secondary clause, a legal truth that acted as a fail-safe. Section 22.4 of the agreement stated, "The master supply chain agreement is contingent upon the ethical conduct and fiduciary integrity of the subsidiary head. The global chair reserves the right to terminate all preferential pricing and collect all backdated credits if the subsidiary head acts in a manner detrimental to the reputation or founding values of the corporation." In my world, leaving the woman who built your empire to eat cold, gray rice while you feast on the company's own premium lobster stock is the definition of gross ethical negligence. The strategic intelligence. I felt my voice, once low and fragmented by the hurt of the previous night, sharpen into something lethal. I wasn't just Elena Vance, the mother. I was Elena Vance, the auditor. I spent the morning in my study, my fingers moving with a clear-headed and sharp precision as I prepared the digital guillotine. I opened my laptop and ran the final calculations. Without that 40% cushion, Marcus's company wasn't expanding. It was a sinking ship. He was currently carrying massive short-term debt, predicated on the efficiency of his low costs. The math was devastating. Without that maternal intervention, he was approximately $2.4 million in the red for the quarter. I didn't just own his food supply. I owned his survival. The strategic invitation, I reached for my phone. It was time to set the stage for the clash. I sent a text to the family group chat, my tone perfectly curated, to sound like the confused relic they wanted me to be. I feel much better today. My digestive issues from last night have cleared up completely. And I want to thank you for being so concerned about my health. To celebrate, I'm taking us all to the Gilded Fork at 7 p.m. tonight. My treat. 0 cost to you. Let's enjoy a meal with no leftovers. Chloe replied within minutes, her text dripping with materialistic excitement. Finally, a place that understands quality. Glad you're feeling lucid again, Mom. We'll see you there. I put the phone down and looked at my hands. They didn't tremble. So this is how they repay me? By assuming that a 5-star meal can erase the memory of a cold ceramic bowl? They were so blinded by their disrespectful assumptions that they couldn't see the trap I was laying. They saw an invitation to luxury. They didn't realize they were being invited to their own corporate funeral. The foundation of the empire. As I prepared for the evening, dressing in a tailored navy blazer that hadn't seen the light of day in a decade, I thought about the nature of power. Life lesson. The world often mistakes silence for weakness and patience for obsolescence. We spend our lives building empires for our children, pouring our blood into their veins and our sweat into their foundations. But if you do not teach them to respect the labor that built the walls, they will eventually try to use those same walls to keep you out. I looked at my reflection. The hurt and exhaustion were still there, tucked away in the corners of my eyes, but they were now shielded by a firm, decisive gaze. Marcus and Chloe wanted a world of efficiency and senior vitality. Tonight, I would give them exactly that. I would show them the most efficient way to lose an empire when you've forgotten how to be a human being. The 0-cost dinner was about to begin, and I was the only one who knew that the price was going to be everything they owned. I woke up in my own apartment, a space Marcus often referred to as shabby or sentimental, but which I knew was merely warm. The spatial contrast was a physical relief. Here there were no vaulted ceilings to echo my loneliness, no Swarovski crystals to mock my history. There was only the scent of fresh coffee, the ticking of a wooden clock, and the framed photograph of my late husband, David, sitting on the mantel. In the photo, we were standing in front of our first truck, a rusted, temperamental beast that we had affectionately named the Iron Mule. We weren't wearing designer suits. We were wearing grease-stained jumpsuits and the widest, most hard-working smiles you've ever seen. I sat at my small oak table, the wood worn smooth by years of my hands resting upon it. And I felt the quiet wisdom of 40 years in the industry settling into my bones. The choking sorrow of the previous night's cold rice dinner had crystallized into something much harder, something sharper. So this is how they repay me, I thought, sipping my coffee. Did they really think I had become that senile? Marcus looked at his distribution east firm and saw a throne. He suffered from the most dangerous of delusions of power. He thought the crown made the king, rather than the labor. He had forgotten that I wasn't just his mother. I was the supply chain queen, the hidden asset, the master agreement. I pulled a leather-bound folder from my desk. Inside was the master supply chain and logistics agreement for Vance Global. Marcus had signed the subsidiary contract 3 years ago without reading the fine print, an oversight born of his own materialistic arrogance. He had been so eager to see his name on the glass doors that he never questioned why his operating costs were so miraculously low. For 3 years, I had been his silent benefactor. I had applied a maternal discount, a 40% reduction in procurement costs for every ounce of seafood, every grain of wheat, and every crate of poultry his warehouses moved. I had been self-sacrificing to the point of invisibility, allowing my own parent company to absorb his losses, just so he could feel like a visionary entrepreneur. But there was a secondary clause, a legal truth that acted as a fail-safe. Section 22.4 of the agreement stated, "The master supply chain agreement is contingent upon the ethical conduct and fiduciary integrity of the subsidiary head. The global chair reserves the right to terminate all preferential pricing and collect all backdated credits if the subsidiary head acts in a manner detrimental to the reputation or founding values of the corporation." In my world, leaving the woman who built your empire to eat cold, gray rice while you feast on the company's own premium lobster stock is the definition of gross ethical negligence. The strategic intelligence. I felt my voice, once low and fragmented by the hurt of the previous night, sharpen into something lethal. I wasn't just Elena Vance, the mother. I was Elena Vance, the auditor. I spent the morning in my study, my fingers moving with a clear-headed and sharp precision as I prepared the digital guillotine. I opened my laptop and ran the final calculations. Without that 40% cushion, Marcus's company wasn't expanding. It was a sinking ship. He was currently carrying massive short-term debt, predicated on the efficiency of his low costs. The math was devastating. Without that maternal intervention, he was approximately $2.4 million in the red for the quarter. I didn't just own his food supply. I owned his survival. The strategic invitation, I reached for my phone. It was time to set the stage for the clash. I sent a text to the family group chat, my tone perfectly curated, to sound like the confused relic they wanted me to be. I feel much better today. My digestive issues from last night have cleared up completely. And I want to thank you for being so concerned about my health. To celebrate, I'm taking us all to the Gilded Fork at 7 p.m. tonight. My treat. 0 cost to you. Let's enjoy a meal with no leftovers. Chloe replied within minutes, her text dripping with materialistic excitement. Finally, a place that understands quality. Glad you're feeling lucid again, Mom. We'll see you there. I put the phone down and looked at my hands. They didn't tremble. So this is how they repay me? By assuming that a 5-star meal can erase the memory of a cold ceramic bowl? They were so blinded by their disrespectful assumptions that they couldn't see the trap I was laying. They saw an invitation to luxury, They didn't realize they were being invited to their own corporate funeral, the foundation of the empire. As I prepared for the evening, dressing in a tailored navy blazer that hadn't seen the light of day in a decade, I thought about the nature of power. Life lesson. The world often mistakes silence for weakness and patience for obsolescence. We spend our lives building empires for our children, pouring our blood into their veins and our sweat into their foundations. But if you do not teach them to respect the labor that built the walls, they will eventually try to use those same walls to keep you out. I looked at my reflection. The hurt and exhaustion were still there, tucked away in the corners of my eyes, but they were now shielded by a firm, decisive gaze. Marcus and Chloe wanted a world of efficiency and senior vitality. Tonight, I would give them exactly that. I would show them the most efficient way to lose an empire when you've forgotten how to be a human being. The zero-cost dinner was about to begin, and I was the only one who knew that the price was going to be everything they owned. The Gilded Fork was not merely a restaurant. It was a cathedral of materialistic excess, a place where the scent of white truffle oil and aged oak was so thick it felt like breathing in money. As I stepped through the heavy brass doors, the hostess, a woman whose posture was as rigid as a frozen supply line, gave me a look of practiced indifference. To her, I was just an elderly woman in a tailored but dated navy blazer. She didn't see the woman who had negotiated the very logistics contracts that ensured her kitchen had a fresh Wagyu beef and Icelandic salt every morning. The spatial contrast was jarring. Only 24 hours ago, I was sitting in a vaulted tomb of a dining room eating gray, refrigerated rice. Now I was surrounded by gold leaf, velvet, and the soft, rhythmic clinking of crystal. I felt the quiet wisdom of my 40 years in the industry settling into my spine. I wasn't here to eat. I was here to conduct an audit of my son's soul. Marcus and Chloe were already seated at a premier booth, the kind of table you only get if you have Vance on your business card or a 5-figure watch on your wrist. Chloe was mid-laugh, her diamonds catching the warm, amber light of the chandeliers. When they saw me, the laughter didn't reach their eyes. It died into a look of weary, disrespectful tolerance. "Mom, you're on time. Impressive," Marcus said, not standing up to greet me. He was busy scanning the wine list with the intensity of a man who thought price was a synonym for taste. "Chloe was worried you might have gotten confused with the GPS. It's a bit of a drive from your part of town." "I know the way, Marcus," I said, my voice clear-headed and sharp. I sat down, smoothing my silk scarf. "I helped scout this location for the developer 10 years ago. It's good to see the senior vitality blogs haven't kept you from a place this indulgent." Chloe smirked, her eyes flicking to my blazer. "We're just glad you're feeling lucid enough for a real meal, Elena. Last night was, well, let's just say we were worried about your cognitive drift. But tonight is on you, right? You said zero cost to us." "Zero cost," I repeated, a thin smile touching my lips. Did they really think I had become that senile? They were so blinded by the cold luxury of the moment that they didn't realize they were sitting in the mouth of a trap. The greed of the scavengers. The waiter appeared, his movements a choreographed dance of subservience. Marcus didn't even look at the menu. He ordered with the delusions of power that only come to those who have never had to build the world they inhabit. We'll start with the Osetra caviar, Marcus commanded, then the Wagyu tartare, and bring us the 2015 Latour. My mother is celebrating her clarity. I watched them. I watched the way they fell upon the appetizers like wolves who had forgotten how to hunt, only knowing how to scavenge. Chloe spoke of the Vance East expansion as if it were a fait accompli, her voice bubbling with the excitement of someone who viewed a supply chain as a magic trick rather than a hard-working reality of trucks, fuel, and human sweat. I sipped my water and mentally ran the numbers. Every oyster they slurped, every drop of that $1,200 wine was moving through a system I controlled. Marcus believed Vance Global was an ATM. He didn't understand the hidden asset currently sitting in my handbag, the signed revocation of his 40% maternal discount. The mathematics of the fall. In the world of logistics, your profit is the sliver of light between your procurement cost and your delivery price. Marcus was operating on a 15% net margin, but that margin only existed because I was subsidizing 40% of his costs. By midnight, that 0.60 was going back to 1.00. His 15% profit was about to become a 25% loss. He wasn't just eating a lobster. He was eating his own company's equity. The final supper. "Mom, you're awfully quiet," Marcus said, his mouth full of Wagyu. "Not having second thoughts about the bill, are you? You did say zero cost." "I'm just savoring the moment, Marcus," I said, my tone firm and decisive. It's rare to see someone enjoy a meal with such abandon. It reminds me of the early days before we had distribution east. Back when your father and I would share a single sandwich in the cab of the truck just to make sure we had enough for your school lunch. Chloe let out a theatrical sigh, her fork pausing over a truffle-crusted sea bass. "Elena, really? Must we always go back to the Iron Mule stories? We've moved past the grease-stained jumpsuits. Marcus is a visionary now. The past is just leftovers." "So this is how they repay me, by calling the blood and plasma I sold leftovers?" I felt the hurt and exhaustion of the previous night dissolve into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. "The past is the foundation, Chloe," I said softly. "And if you don't respect the foundation, the whole structure tends to drift. But you're right. Tonight is about the future. My treat. Enjoy the Latour, Marcus. It's a very efficient vintage." I looked at my watch. 8:45 p.m. In 3 hours and 15 minutes, the automated credit stop would hit his servers. The warehouses would lock. The trucks would be geo-fenced. And the man who offered his mother cold rice would find himself standing in a very empty, very expensive room. Life lesson. The most dangerous place to be is at a table where you don't know who is paying the price. We often mistake a parent's self-sacrifice for a permanent resource. We think the supply chain of love has no end until the day we realize we've been overdrawing the account for years. The main course arrived, a massive 2-pound Maine lobster for Marcus, identical to the one from the night before. He cracked the shell with a sickening, wet snap. I watched him, my eyes clear-headed and sharp, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a mother. I felt like an auditor, and the bill was coming due. The waiter approached our table with the silent, predatory grace of a shark circling a reef, carrying a small silver tray that held the ultimate verdict of the evening, The bill. In a restaurant like the Gilded Fork, the check isn't just a piece of paper. It's a ledger of social standing, a thick, cream-colored document tucked into a leather folder that smelled of old money and the sweat of the people who actually work for it. Marcus didn't even reach for it. He didn't even look at it. He was too busy leaning back, swirling the last of the $1,200 wine in his glass, his face flushed with a materialistic triumph that made my skin crawl. "Go ahead, Mom," he said, his voice dripping with a disrespectful condescension that vibrated in the air between us. "Pick up the tab. And it's the least you can do for the visionary who's taking your little truck route company into the 21st century. Chloe and I were just discussing. Once we get those Tier 1 voting shares from you, we might even put your name on a plaque in the New Jersey lobby. A nice little founder's tribute for the relic who's finally stepped aside." Chloe chuckled, her diamonds flashing like cold, distant stars as she tucked her gold compact into her purse. "It's about senior vitality, Elena. Knowing when to let go is the highest form of clarity. You've had your fun playing CEO, but the machine is too big for you now. Just pay the man and let's get to the gala. We've wasted enough time on memory lane tonight." I felt the quiet wisdom of my decades in the industry crystallize into a single, sharp point of light. And the hurt and exhaustion of the cold rice dinner, the selling of my plasma, the frozen winter drives, it all evaporated, leaving behind the cold electric hum of strategic intelligence. I didn't reach for my purse. I reached for the folder. I opened it slowly. The total was $4,842.16. Did they really think I had become that senile? "Marcus," I said, my voice no longer low or fragmented. It was the firm, decisive voice that had commanded 1,000-driver fleet through 3 recessions. It was the voice of the sovereign. "I told you that tonight's dinner would be $0 for you. Do you remember that?" "Yeah, Mom, we get it," Marcus snapped, his delusions of power finally fraying at the edges of his patience. "You're being generous, very lucid of you. Now just give him the card so we can leave." I looked at the waiter and then back at my son. I closed the leather folder with a soft, final thud. "I wasn't being generous, Marcus. I was being literal. This meal is $0 for you because I have officially closed every corporate account associated with your name. And since your personal accounts were all secured by Vance Global assets I have reclaimed as of 5 p.m. today, you are quite effectively penniless." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a supply chain snapping in the middle of a blizzard. "What are you talking about?" Chloe hissed, her face contorting into a mask of pure, materialistic panic. "That's impossible. Marcus is the head of distribution east." Marcus was a licensed operator under a master agreement that he was too arrogant to read, I said, my tone clear-headed and sharp. Section 22.4, Marcus. Ethical negligence. Leaving the woman who built your empire to eat scraps while you feast on company stock is a breach of the core values clause. I've revoked your license. I've geofenced your trucks. I've locked your warehouses. And as for this dinner, I slid the leather folder toward the center of the table. I'm not paying it. My accounts are private, secure, and entirely separate from the wreckage of your failed subsidiary. My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Marcus. It was the laboratory where I planned your return to reality. Marcus reached for his wallet, his hands trembling with a frantic, disrespectful energy. He pulled out his black corporate card and shoved it at the waiter. "Run it! She's crazy! She's just confused! Run the damn card!" The waiter, ever the professional, she took the card to the terminal at the side station. We all watched. I watched with the quiet wisdom of a woman who knew exactly what the screen would say. Beep, 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 the sound of a life being dismantled. "Declined, sir," the waiter said, his voice as cold as the rice they had served me. "Try the other one," Chloe shrieked, dumping her purse onto the velvet seat. "Try the gold card. Try the platinum." One by one, the plastic came back dead. Every hidden asset Marcus thought he possessed had been neutralized by the woman he called a relic. He had forgotten that I didn't just build the machine. I owned the electricity that ran it. The closing moral line. "You've forgotten who actually built this empire, Marcus," I said, standing up and smoothing my navy blazer. "You thought you were the king because I let you wear the crown. But the crown belongs to the labor, not the ego. I may be old, but I am not foolish. I am the supply chain. And tonight I've decided to cut off your supply." I looked at my son, whose face was now the color of the gray stir-fry he had deemed efficient for me. He looked small. He looked like the scavenger I had realized he was. "I'm going to the airport now," I said, my voice fast and firm, signifying my victory. "Jim is waiting outside in the car. I hear the Maine coast is lovely this time of year. If you need me, don't call. I've blocked your number on the company server. I suggest you talk to the manager about the efficiency of washing dishes. I hear they have plenty of cold rice in the back for the help." I walked out of the Gilded Fork without looking back. The clash was over. The $0 declaration was the last thing I would ever say to the boy who forgot how to be a son. Philosophical life lesson: respect is the currency of the soul. If you spend your life overdrawing the account of those who sacrificed for you, do not be surprised when the vault is empty when you need it most. We build foundations for our children so they can stand tall. But if they use that height to look down on us, it is our duty to remind them exactly whose shoulders they are standing on. My dignity was never for sale, and tonight I bought back my freedom. The silence at our table was no longer the heavy, expectant quiet of a 5-star dinner. It was the hollow, ringing silence of a vacuum. Marcus stared at the small slip of paper, the declined receipt, as if it were a poisonous insect that had crawled out of his $1,200 bottle of wine. His face, once flushed with the materialistic heat of the wagyu and the lobster, had turned the color of damp parchment. I sat there, my navy blazer buttoned, my spine as straight as the iron mule's axle. I felt the quiet wisdom of my 70 years acting as a cold, stabilizing anchor. I wasn't the relic they had tried to starve into submission. I was the architect of their current reality. "Try it again," Marcus hissed at the waiter, his voice cracking, the delusions of power finally splintering. "It's a mistake. The server must be down. Do you know who I am? I'm Marcus Vance, Vance Distribution East." The waiter, a man who had seen 1,000 visionaries fall in this dining room, didn't blink. "I'm sorry, sir. The system is perfectly functional. All 3 of your corporate cards, as well as the personal platinum, have been flagged as closed by issuer. Chloe's hand flew to her throat, her diamonds flashing mockingly in the amber light. "Elena, what is this? What have you done?" Her voice was a sharp, disrespectful trill of panic. "You said this dinner was $0. You said you were taking us out." "And I am a woman of my word, Chloe," I said, my voice now clear-headed and sharp, cutting through her hysteria like a blade. "This meal is indeed $0 for me, because I own the holding company that provides the line of credit for this entire establishment's seafood contract. And it is $0 for you, because you no longer have a single cent to your name to pay for it." So this is how they repay me, I thought, looking at Marcus's trembling hands. Did they really think I had become that senile? The audit of the empire. Marcus looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You closed the accounts? You can't do that. That's my operating capital. I have payroll on Monday. I have the New Jersey expansion." "There is no New Jersey expansion, Marcus," I said, the pacing of my words quickening, signifying my victory. "And there is no payroll. I spent this morning with my legal team. We didn't just revoke your 40% maternal discount. We triggered the full audit clause. We found the ghost invoices you've been using to fund this mansion and Chloe's senior vitality blogs. It's called embezzlement, Marcus. In the real world, we call it a Tier 1 ethics violation." I leaned over the table, the spatial contrast between my calm and his disarray filling the room. "You thought you were a visionary because your procurement costs were low. You thought you were a genius because the trucks always showed up on time. But the trucks showed up because I signed the fuel contracts. The costs were low because I paid the difference. You weren't building a distribution network. You were playing in a sandbox I built for you." "Mom, please," he whimpered, a sound so small it belonged to the 5-year-old boy in the rusted truck, not the man in the designer suit. "You can't ruin me. I'm your son." "You were my son when I was selling my blood to buy your milk, Marcus," I replied, my voice clear-headed and sharp. "But last night, when you served me cold rice and told me I was a relic while you feasted on my own company's lobster, you became a stranger. You became a liability. And in logistics, Marcus, we always cut the underperforming routes." The legal guillotine. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my purse, the hidden asset of the evening. It was the Life Estate Amendment to the Vance Global Charter. "You see this, Marcus? Section 22.4. You signed it 3 years ago when you were so eager to get your hands on the regional office. It states that all subsidiary assets remain the sole property of the global chair until the day of my passing, provided I am not declared incompetent. And as of 9 a.m. this morning, 3 board-certified neurologists have signed off on my perfect mental health." Chloe grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my sleeve. "Elena, think about the children. Think about our status. We'll be the laughingstock of the gala." I gently but firmly removed her hand. "Status is a luxury of the grateful, Chloe. As for the children, they will learn the hard-working truth of where their bread comes from. They will learn it far better than Marcus did, because I won't be there to shield them from the cold. I'm done being the self-sacrificing ghost in your machine." I looked at the waiter. "Please keep the folder on the table. My son will be staying behind to discuss the efficiency of their dishwashing station. I hear they are short-staffed tonight." I turned to Marcus. to who was staring at the $4,842.16 bill as if it were a death warrant. You told me last night that my quiet wisdom couldn't keep up with the digital age, Marcus, I said, a thin clinical smile touching my lips. But you forgot the most basic rule of the digital age. He who owns the server owns the data, and he who owns the supply owns the world. My kindness was never a doormat for you to wipe your feet on, Marcus. It was the laboratory where I planned your return to reality. You've forgotten who built this empire, so now you get the privilege of seeing what it looks like from the bottom. I suggest you start with the rice. I hear it's quite light on the digestive system. I walked away from the table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. I didn't look back at the materialistic wreckage of their lives. I walked out the heavy brass doors of the Gilded Fork. Jim was waiting at the curb in my black luxury sedan. He opened the door for me, his face showing a flicker of a smile. He remembered the smell of the diesel in 1988. Where to, Mrs. Vance? To the coast, Jim. I've spent 70 years feeding others. I think it's time I finally sat down to a meal where I don't have to share a single bite with a scavenger. The silver tray resting on the white linen between us held more than just a piece of thermal paper. It held the final crushing weight of a legacy Marcus had tried to dismantle. The folder was open, and the total, $4,842.16, stared up at my son like a death warrant. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving behind a sallow, sickly gray that reminded me of the cold rice he had served me only 24 hours prior. He stared at the 4 declined slips the waiter had quietly placed on the table, 4 plastic monuments to his own materialistic failure. There must be a mistake, Marcus stammered, his voice no longer the arrogant roar of a visionary, but the thin, pathetic whine of a boy who had finally run out of other people's money. Mom, just use your card. I'll transfer the funds tomorrow. This is embarrassing. People are looking. I looked around the room. Yes, they were looking. The elite of the city, the very people Chloe had spent years trying to impress, with her senior vitality nonsense and her disrespectful dismissals of my history, were now witnessing the Vance East machine grind to a spectacular public halt. The only mistake, Marcus, was your belief that the supply chain of my love had no end, I said. My voice was now firm and decisive, vibrating with the authority of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding fleets through the dark. You've spent years overdrawing the account of my self-sacrifice. Tonight, you've hit the limit. The scavenger's desperation. Chloe grabbed the leather folder, her hands shaking so violently her diamond bracelets clattered like a warning bell. Elena, you can't do this. And this is a 5-star establishment. We're guests here. If we don't pay this, it's theft. Do you want your own son arrested? I'm not the one who ordered the beluga caviar and the $1,200 vintage, Chloe, I replied, my tone clear-headed and sharp. I ordered water. I told you this meal was $0 for you because I knew your accounts would be frozen. I gave you a choice last night. You could have treated me with the dignity a mother deserves, or you could have treated me like a relic. You chose the latter, and now you're looking at the bill for that choice. Marcus lunged for his phone, his fingers frantically tapping. I'll call the bank. I'll call the New Jersey creditors. They'll extend the line. They have to. I'm Marcus Vance." "They won't answer, Marcus," I said, leaning forward. "As of 5:01 p.m., the Vance Global, the parent company that I own, notified every lender that we have withdrawn our corporate guarantee for your subsidiary. Because I have invoked the ethical negligence clause, your debt to the parent company has been called in. Your personal assets, which you so brilliantly used as collateral for your visionary expansion, are currently being held in a legal vice." The math of his downfall was as simple as a logistics manifest. His equity was gone. He was standing on a mountain made of air. The efficiency of the dish pit. The manager of the Gilded Fork approached, his expression a masterpiece of polite, cold hostility. He looked at the declined slips, then at Marcus, whose delusions of power were now melting into a visible sweat. "Is there a problem with the payment, Mr. Vance?" the manager asked, his voice low enough to be terrifying. "My mother she's paying," Marcus said, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She's the global chair, Elena Vance. Tell him, Mom. Tell him you're paying." I stood up, smoothing my tailored navy blazer. I looked at the manager, a man I had known for a decade. "I'm afraid my son is mistaken, Arthur. I am a guest of the evening, but I am not the host. I've already paid my share. 40 years of blood, sweat, and hard-working loyalty. The rest of this ledger belongs to them." I turned to Chloe, who was looking at her designer purse as if it might suddenly sprout a miracle. "You told me last night that my digestive system was weak and that I should eat efficiently to avoid waste. Well, look at that table, Chloe. Look at the waste. The uneaten lobster, the half-finished wine, and it's the perfect portrait of your life." So this is how they repay me, I thought, looking at Marcus one last time. Did they really think I had become that senile? "I've spoken to the chef," I said, my voice cutting through the soft jazz of the restaurant. "They are indeed short-staffed in the back tonight. If you can't find a way to pay for your indulgences, perhaps you can show the manager how efficient you can be with a sponge and a pile of greasy plates. I hear the dish pit is a very senior vitality-friendly environment, lots of steam and movement." The final severance, Marcus grabbed the sleeve of my blazer, a desperate, disrespectful tug. "Mom, you can't leave us here. We'll be ruined. The social fallout, the business, everything." I gently but firmly unpried his fingers from my arm. The choking sorrow I had felt at the beginning of the weekend was gone, replaced by a cold, pristine freedom. The social fallout is just a symptom of a bankruptcy of character, Marcus. You didn't just lose my money, you lost my respect. And in my world, respect is the only currency that matters. I looked at the bill on the silver tray, $4,842.16. A tiny fraction of the millions he owed me, but the most important debt he would ever face. "Enjoy the rice in the back, Marcus," I said, a thin, clinical smile touching my lips. "I hear it's quite light on the stomach. And as for the New Jersey expansion, don't worry. I've already sent a team to reclaim the warehouses. I'm putting the Iron Mule logo back on the gates tomorrow morning." I didn't wait for his answer. I didn't wait for Chloe's tears, in which were already beginning to ruin her expensive mascara. I walked away from the table, my heels clicking a rhythmic, decisive beat against the marble floor. Behind me, I heard the manager's voice. cold and final. "Mr. Vance, if you'll step into my office." I walked through the brass doors and into the night. The clash was over. The consequence was finally, beautifully, in motion. I was no longer a mother being fed scraps. I was the auditor, and I had just closed the most expensive account of my life. Life lesson. Never mistake a parent's silence for a lack of knowledge, and never mistake their kindness for a lack of a backbone. We build empires so our children can stand on our shoulders, but if they use that height to spit on us, we have every right to step aside and let them see how far the drop really is. But the bill for a lifetime of disrespect is always higher than you think. And tonight Marcus Vance found out that he couldn't afford the price. The heavy brass doors of the Gilded Fork didn't just close behind me. They sealed a tomb. The muffled sound of Marcus's frantic high-pitched pleading and the rhythmic clatter of Chloe's expensive bracelets, now nothing more than gilded handcuffs, faded into a blessed, absolute silence. I stood on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, the night air of the city hitting my face with a bracing, electric clarity. It was the first breath of air I had taken in years that didn't taste of someone else's expectations. The choking sorrow that had sat in my chest like a leaden weight for the last 48 hours had finally, beautifully, evaporated. In its place was a cold, shimmering strategic intelligence that felt like a well-oiled engine humming in the dark. I looked at my hands. They were steady, no longer the fragmented hands of a woman being fed cold rice. They were the hands that built an empire, and tonight they were finally holding the wheel again. Waiting at the curb was my black luxury sedan, a long, sleek shadow against the neon blur of the city. Jim, my driver, stood by the rear door. He was a man who had been with me since 1988, back when the Vance logo was just a stencil on a rusted side panel, and we shared thermoses of bitter coffee to stay awake through the Appalachian passes. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what had happened inside. He saw the way I walked, firm, decisive. My chin lifted to the level of the skyscrapers, and he simply nodded. He saw the supply chain queen had returned from exile. "Is the route clear, Jim?" I asked. My voice was no longer the low, wounded whisper of a grandmother. It was sharp, resonant, and faster in its pacing. The victory wasn't just in my mind. It was in my marrow. "All systems go, Mrs. Vance," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of a smile. "Sarah just messaged. The geofencing on the New Jersey fleet is active. The East Coast servers have been redirected to the global hub. The subsidiary is dark." "Good," I said, stepping into the plush, leather-scented warmth of the back seat. "Let the scavengers find their own way home. I've spent 70 years mapping the world for them. It's time they learned how to read a compass in the dark." The view from the moving window. As the car pulled away from the curb, I looked through the tinted glass one last time. Through the window of the Gilded Fork, I could see the manager leading Marcus and Chloe toward the back of the house. Chloe was clutching her designer purse, as if it were a life raft, her face a mask of ruined mascara and materialistic horror. Marcus looked small, terrifyingly small. He looked like the boy who used to cry when the iron mule wouldn't start in the winter. Only now, there was no mother to sell her blood to fix the engine for him. Did they really think I had become that senile? The thought made me let out a short, sharp laugh that startled even me. They had mistaken my self-sacrificing silence for a lack of a pulse. They had seen the silver hair and the slow gait, and assumed the master of the house had become a ghost. They had forgotten that in the world of logistics, the person who owns the supply of the soul is the only one who truly survives the winter. I pulled my tablet from the seat pocket and tapped the screen. A map of the tri-state area appeared, dotted with hundreds of blue icons, my trucks, my warehouses, my legacy. One by one, the icons for Vance East began to blink red, then turn gray. "So this is how I repay you," I whispered to the empty seat beside me, "with the truth of your own insignificance. The severance of the supply." I tapped a final command, sending a memo to every major food vendor in the region. The preferential supply was officially severed. No more discounts, no more grace periods, no more maternal credits to cover for a son's disrespectful incompetence. "Jim," I said, leaning back into the soft luxury that I had earned with 40 years of sweat and plasma center bandages, "forget the apartment. I don't want to be surrounded by the ghosts of their senior vitality blogs tonight." "Where to, then?" "The coast. I want to go to the Maine house. I want to smell the salt and the diesel. I want to sit on the porch and watch the tide come in, knowing that for the first time in my life, I don't have to save a single scrap for anyone else." The car accelerated, the lights of the city blurring into a stream of gold and silver. The spatial contrast was absolute. From the trash bowl of cold rice to the limitless horizon of my own authority. Marcus and Chloe were now relics of a past I had outgrown. They were the leftovers now. I felt a profound sense of freedom. It wasn't the loud, rowdy freedom of the young. It was the quiet, heavy freedom of a woman who has finally closed the ledger and found herself in the black. Life lesson. The hardest part of the rise isn't the fight. It's the departure. It's the moment you realize that your kindness was never a doormat, but a bridge, and that you have every right to burn that bridge behind you if the people crossing it refuse to acknowledge the weight of your sacrifice. I closed my eyes as the city receded into the rearview mirror. The supply chain queen was off the grid, and for the first time, the only person I had to account for was the woman in the glass. "Drive, Jim," I commanded, my voice decisive and final. "We have a very long, very beautiful road ahead of us." Part 12. The philosophy of the rise, the lessons. The salt air of the Maine coast doesn't just clean the lungs, it scrubs the soul. I sat on the weathered cedar porch of my cottage, a small, sturdy structure perched on a granite cliff overlooking the Atlantic. This was a warm space filled with the smell of pine needles, old books, and the deep, rhythmic breath of the tide. The spatial contrast was absolute. I was 500 miles away from the vaulted and echoing mausoleum of Marcus's mansion, and a universe away from the materialistic rot that had nearly swallowed my spirit. I held a mug of coffee, hot, black, and brewed by my own hands, and watched the sunrise bleed gold across the water. For the first time in 40 years, my knuckles didn't ache from the cold of a steering wheel or the tension of a boardroom. The hurt and exhaustion that had defined my life since 1986 had finally, beautifully, settled into a quiet sediment. I was no longer the self-sacrificing ghost of Vance Global. I was Elena, and I was finally, irrevocably, whole. I looked at a small silver-framed photo on the table beside me. It wasn't of a gala or a ribbon cutting. It was a Polaroid of David and me in 1988, leaning against the iron mule, our faces smeared with grease, but our eyes bright with a hard-working hope. We were builders then. We knew the value of every penny because we knew the cost of every drop of plasma I had sold and every hour of sleep he had sacrificed. Did I really think I had become that senile? I asked myself, a thin smile touching my lips. No, I had simply been too kind. I had mistaken my son's ambition for growth, when in reality it was just a cancer of entitlement. I had spent my life building a skyscraper for a man who didn't even know how to mix the mortar. The curriculum of dignity. As the sun cleared the horizon, the quiet wisdom of my journey began to crystallize into a set of truths. I realized that the dignity rise wasn't just about a bank account or a legal victory. It was about the reclamation of the self and the boundary of kindness. My first lesson was the most painful to learn. My kindness was never a doormat for others to wipe their feet on. We often tell ourselves that unconditional love means unconditional tolerance. We think that by absorbing the blows of our children's arrogance, we are protecting them. But I realized at that table of cold rice that I wasn't protecting Marcus. I was enabling a scavenger. Love without boundaries isn't a gift. It's a permission slip for cruelty. The foundation versus the ego. Marcus suffered from the ultimate delusion of power. He believed he was the architect because he lived in the penthouse. He had forgotten that you've forgotten who built this empire. He thought the modern machine of the digital age had replaced the relic of the physical labor. But the supply chain of the world and the supply chain of the human heart still runs on integrity, sweat, and the courage to look at the books honestly. The power of the hidden asset. Your greatest weapon isn't your money. It's your strategic intelligence and your history. Marcus and Chloe saw a relic because they only looked at the surface. They didn't see the master agreement in my mind or the legal truth in my drawer. Never let the world convince you that your age is a liability. In the game of life, the veteran always knows where the trapdoors are because she's the one who built the floor. The final audit. I received a letter yesterday from Sarah, my lawyer. It was clinical and clear-headed, much like the auditor I had become. Marcus and Chloe have been forced to vacate the mansion. The New Jersey expansion has been folded back into the global hub. Marcus is currently working as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a rival firm, a job he only got because of his last name, and a job that requires him to clock in at 5 a.m. every single day. I hear he's learning the efficiency of a commute. I hear Chloe has stopped blogging about senior vitality now that she has to manage her own system on a real-world budget. There was no apology in the letter, and I didn't expect one. Scavengers only apologize when they think it will get them back to the table. But the table is gone. I burned the preferential supply bridge and watched it light up the night. The freedom of the sovereign. I am 70 years old and my digestive system is stronger than ever. I eat what I want, when I want. And I never eat alone because I am finally in the company of a woman I respect. The dignity rise is complete. I started at the rock bottom of a cold rice bowl, and I rose to the platinum tier of my own soul. I am Elena Vance. I am the supply chain queen. I am the architect of my own peace. I stood up from my chair, my movements firm and decisive. The pacing of my life had finally accelerated to the speed of joy. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the infinite blue of the Atlantic. The iron mule was long gone. but the engine that powered it was still roaring in my chest. "So this is how I repay myself," I whispered to the wind, "with the truth of who I am." I went inside, closed the door on the past, and sat down to a breakfast of fresh Maine lobster, steaming hot and dripping with butter. It was the most efficient meal of my life. Final moral: dignity is not a status given by others. It is a fortress you build within yourself. If you spend your life feeding those who refuse to acknowledge your sacrifice, eventually you will starve. But if you have the courage to reclaim the keys to your own empire, you will find that the view from the top is much better when you're the one who owns the mountain. My journey began with a betrayal, but it ended with a coronation. The queen is back on her throne, and the books are finally closed.